So as you can see, it's a very non-diverse panel because we're all finance people, and I think it's a good thing for me. It will make my job much easier. But at the same time, it's diverse because we have different perspectives, public sector, we have someone with experience from a regional bank, somebody who has an experience from a local bank, and we've all been exposed to public policy. So without further ado, let me start with you, Minister. We have had a rough time, I think, as a country due to COVID. The side of health has done very well, and I know there's been a discussion around how the government has handled the pandemic, but the cost on the economy has been quite harsh. And I'd like to start maybe by you giving us a glimpse on what has been the impact of COVID on trade internally, and then if we project a little bit externally, what does that mean for our expectations to benefit from the FCTA and kind of the more African trade? So if we could start with that, and then maybe we'll go into the digital platform and what does it mean for future opportunities. Thank you, Minister.
Okay, thank you. I'm glad to be with you today with this audience. I think with what you have been passing through with this pandemic period, most of the industries have been really hindrance by the pandemic, and we can see that for the couple of policies which have been put in place to try to manage it, we have the manufacturing industries which have been put as a priority due to the fact that with this way all the countries were being in a kind of nationalization, the impact has been great for the international trade. I think that among the countries which have been taking some policies in place, some priorities have related to what we are based at. And I would say, like for the country, for Rwanda itself, some policies have been put in place, like the strategies to identify those industries. I would say specifically for the manufacturing, light manufacturing, as one of the fields where it was allowing to recover quickly. When I talk about light manufacturing, it's rather having those semi-finished products which can be finalized in a country and then allowed to increase the job creation. The second area which has been identified to really work on that imbalances was to create some agro-processing activities, because manufacturing is really the field where it can provide some boost to recover. And then for agro-processing, as is one of the fields that has not been affected by the pandemic, it was also with a kind of strategies to put it in place. The third area was really for the construction, like a field where we can see that though the pandemic was really continuing all over the world, the construction is something which creates job and also increase the revenues. So for all of those areas, it has been put in place some incentives in order to facilitate the recovery and to facilitate also the way it is done locally in the countries. I would say that apart from this, the approach has been regional in the sense that we have some already regional blocks here and there in Africa, but the most important thing is related to the one single market, the African Continental Free Trade Area. For that specific area, though it has been starting, we're glad that it has been starting in January to be operational over the continent, and we consider it as one of the areas where we can increase the intra-African trade and then allow the countries to boost up for their production. I would say again that apart from this, we have had on the international side also to work on the exports, because we see that though some countries, due to these consequences of pandemic, have been stuck with importing or exporting, some complication, especially with the global logistic markets. But we see that with the work done with a couple of institutions to leverage the non-tariff barriers in the countries is also one of the key things which have been affecting the trade. We do believe that also the way we have the financial systems and the operational schemes is one of the key when it comes to one continent raising the voice to facilitate the debt here on the continent. I will not go that far on that area, but we would say that the imbalances are still on during this pandemic, and but the ways of getting a recovery path is also doable, in the sense that with these continental voices raised to the institutions, it allows us to recover from it.
Follow-up point, and thank you, Honorable Minister. You talked about manufacturing. And before COVID hit all of us, there was a lot of buzz around the fourth industrial revolution. And a lot of the buzz was coming from the ICT field, the new technologies, AI, machine learning, and coming from the Silicon Valleys of the world. But we haven't really heard how the manufacturers themselves are embracing these new technologies. So before, we were hoping that Africa would leapfrog using the fourth industrial revolution. We already missed the first industrial revolution, the second, the third. The rest of the world is now on the fourth. And the question that we're asking ourselves is, are we going to miss the fourth now that a lot of the focus has been in production of basic goods post-COVID? Or will the manufacturers have incentive, and are they even interested in adopting these new technologies, especially African manufacturers?
I don't know if I would say we have missed the three first industrial revolutions, or if we are not ready for it. I think it's rather in terms of readiness, because we just saw them coming. But related to the fourth industrial revolution, I would say that we have, the continent has to break with what I would call like the colonial trap, where it was seen that the African countries are considered as producers of raw materials or primary products. We are in a stage where we have to really change the value and add a value on what we are giving. I'll give you just an example. I think there's a report from KPMG which was showing that for the whole year of 2018, it was the continent have been able to export around $6 billion in terms of coffee. But at the end, when you put into blending, roasting, packaging, marketing, the developed countries which receive those raw materials out of that coffee have been able to amount a value of $100. This gives a comparison on how we have really to change from just exporting or producing primary products or raw materials, because between 6 billion and 100 billion there is a big difference. The same can also apply to these highly knowledge-intensive products. Let's say these smartphones, when you can have like an iPhone which was costing in the USA market like $600, while the minerals which have been extracted from Africa were like at the cost of $1. I think this is one of some of examples to show us how we have to move in the industrial process from producing and exporting these primary and raw material products to added value products. But when it comes to the industrialization, I think that there are two challenges I would like to highlight. I find important. The first one in the vision is to consider to have an industrialization which mitigate or adapt. We have to consider industrialization when it mitigates or adapt the human-induced climate change. I think it's something very, very important if you go through industrialization during this era, due to the fact that with some figures we have the global warming which is going to increase beyond what was expected. I think in the UN special report of 2018, they were showing how from 2035 to 2052, we will have an increase of 1.5 degrees. And it was expected, but at the end of the century, we will have an increase of 3 degrees, while what was expected was less than 2. This means that we have, as countries, as an implication, we have to go through an industrialization which is paying attention to a transition to a low-carbon economy. The second thing, it implies that we have to invest in what I would call a green industrialization. We have really to invest in new technologies which are keen to green industrialization. And then that will be a first point, I think, very important to pay attention to. The second, when it goes to this fourth industrialization, is related to the way we transfer technology. For what we are seeing, we need to pay attention to some disruptions in the businesses. In terms of disruption, I would like to, let's say when we have this relocation of industries, I can give just an example. We have Adidas company, which has been relocating from Bangladesh to Germany due to the fact that they were seeking for those new technologies in Germany, and then they have been able to compare and find that the cost using those new technologies is giving a cost of production lower than going to the low wages in Asia. So I think that in that area, when we go to industrialization, we have to also consider the fact that that level is also going to impact our industries. Another area I would highlight is that when you go for that, like Africa, we should focus on what we are good at or we are best at. I would highlight agribusiness, which is something which keeps working even through all the ages, but also smart agriculture, also an area we can work on, as well as all the infrastructure related to that. As a beginning, we can start from. But I think we have also to pay attention to the way, as a continent, we can create a policy space where we protect ourselves against unfair trade rules, because that has been done during the first, second, and third industrial revolutions by other countries. But as a continent, we have to think about it. I will just highlight the current reform with the World Trade Organization, where we have to really be involved in the dispute settlement to see if it is really working in a favor of an intercession for the continent, as well as what is being done with the AfCFTA, the African Continental Free Trade Area, where also, though it has been operational since January this year, but to really be very motivated and implicated in creating such a dispute settlement to really remove all the non-tariff barriers and also the other barriers we can have, and also to set the disputes, because with protecting our industrialization, the nascent industries, it's one of the ways also to strengthen our African manufacturing.
We now know that payment systems can drive business. We've seen mobile money, driving particular types of business, and maybe Minister Beata can touch on that after. But I'd like to ask you, as a banker who have a lot of your clients who try to bank with their fellow customers across Africa, what will change really to make sure that payment systems are more modern and integrated and support African trade?
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. It's quite an impressive audience, almost intimidating, but it's a very interesting discussion. So we are talking about AfCFTA, which is, I think everyone agrees, it was a landmark deal. When you think and you visualize a single African market of over 1 billion people, who are, many of them productive young people, I think it's $3 trillion of GDP, so it's a big market. But for it to work, there is a lot that has to be done. I think the minister touched on it. We need to scale significantly our production capacity, because you trade what you've produced. So we need to first start scaling our production capacity and produce goods and services that other people want to buy. But we need, as the moderator is asking, some soft and hard infrastructure to make trade happen. So payments is one of the soft infrastructure that we have to put in place for people to be able to pay for these goods and services. So today, for a client who is selling goods to, Kinshasa, for example, we will need to involve what we call a hard currency, typically the dollar or the euro. Sometimes I wonder why we call these hard currencies, as if our currencies are soft, but maybe there's a good reason for that. And it's complicated. So I think what the African Union is doing with, I think, Afrexim Bank taking the lead, they set up what is called a PAPSS, which is a Pan-African Payment and Settlement System, which is supposed to allow all Africans to trade in their local currencies. So now, as a banker, obviously, I see the opportunities of us trading, having large currency trading flows, because we'll have clients dealing in CFA, in Congolese franc, in so many currencies, and I see a lot of opportunities there. So what we in Rwanda are doing is many of us, I think Bonaventure, who is also with us on the panel, can attest to that. We are going through digital transformation journeys within the bank, and the main objective is to have all our critical core systems at the bank to allow these critical services to integrate with third-party services. So what we want, typically, I think in the language, we talk about an open API platform. So my core banking system is able to talk to a bank, somewhere in Benin or Nigeria, and we are able then to facilitate payments. So this is something that everyone is going through. It is painful, it is costly, but we believe the benefits for us will be very important. Now, I'm talking about soft infrastructure, but we also need hard infrastructure, because goods need to move from point A to point B, and they can't just travel. They need roads, railway, airports, airplanes, etc. And this is another big, massive investment opportunities for us, for countries, for companies, because to enable this trade, we'll need to build, of course, as I said, first start scaling our production capacity, but also build this soft and hard infrastructure to enable trade to happen. If this doesn't happen, then this single market that we are all dreaming of is not going to happen. It is as simple as that. Maybe another point I would want to make, and I'm happy to see Dr. Kaberuka joining the panel, is that when you look at this AFCTA, of course, everyone is excited. But already today, the growth of non-African-owned companies is far higher than the growth of our own companies, African-owned companies. And I'm thinking with this AFCTA, it's going to facilitate, actually to widen the gap between these companies that are already, many of them in the extractive industries, making a lot of money. And these people are going to benefit more from this deal that was signed by our head of state, and our companies are going to be left behind. So this is a challenge, actually, for all of us as people in the banking or in the financial sector. How do we invest in our production capacities for our companies to benefit from these landmark deals? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Diane. Maybe picking up on your last point, we clearly had, as Minister Beata has indicated, some expected winners of the AFCTA, right, in terms of which kind of entrepreneurs would benefit from the AFCTA. I guess that's what our policymakers had in mind when they signed the AFCTA. With COVID, we've seen some new winners and some new losers. We've all heard about how tech is doing better. Some other industries have fared worse. Do you think that in the post-COVID era, the winners and losers will be different from those that were envisaged under the initial AFCTA mindset or objective? And what can we do to make sure that our losers are not permanent losers and maybe, kind of resurrect in the post-COVID era?
That's a very important question. And indeed, we've seen, actually, when you see these global economies, you've seen the difference between High Street and Wall Street. You'll see, people losing jobs in the US, for example, but on Wall Street, people making a lot of money. So we have, a certain category of people who are winning, even within the pandemic. But when I look at Africa, it's hard to say there was any winner. Probably when you looked at BK's financials, you probably thought BK is still making money, but this is, very, below what we're expecting. So, we're not faring much better than everyone in the country. So I still feel in Africa, on the continent, we need to invest heavily in our production capacities and take risks on our people. I always think about, for example, the first banker who took a risk on Mr. Dangote probably 20, 30 years ago. I think that was a smart guy. And we need in Africa to create not only, probably 1,000 Dangotes. And these are not people who necessarily deal in, very sophisticated IT solutions. We need to to scale our production capacities in goods and services that are used and consumed by Africans. So when I think of us, our role as bankers, is really to look at these sectors where we believe there's a potential and create and support the entrepreneurs, not necessarily in IT. To be honest, I think there's a hype around IT, fintech, etc. It's good, but I think we really need to create hard companies that are building, creating, adding value, and things that are very simple, and it doesn't require very high technological content. I mean, we financed recently a cement factory. It's not far from here, a Prem Cement. And this was, I believe, something very obvious for us to do. Because when you look at cement, it's amongst our top import bills. And in 2 years, someone has been able to build a factory that is producing almost, I think, 700 metric tons a year. And this is something that we need in our country to build our roads, our real estate, etc. So I believe for us in Africa, we really need to focus on these sectors that are probably not very sexy, but that are creating jobs, reducing the trade, supporting the trade balance, etc. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Welcome, Dr. Kaberuka. We're very happy to have you among us today, and we really want to pick your brain on the global perspective. Before your arrival, we discussed the impact on Rwanda. The minister helped us set the stage around what are the lessons learned that we have learned in Rwanda, and some of the programs that we had already before the COVID and that are still important post-COVID. And we've had a discussion around how the mindset has changed, how we need to think about some of these dynamics differently. But we'd like to hear from you on what have been some of the lessons at the global level post-pandemic, and which ones do you think apply to our continent more specifically? Trade or unrelated to trade, since we've seen that now trade can relate to health, trade can relate to so many other areas as well. So
Right.
we're interested to hear your views.
Right. Thank you, Pichette. The problem of coming late is that you never know what was said before you came. So if I do repeat things which have been said here, please call me to order. But in due course, I'll tell you why I was late. It may not be unrelated to what we are discussing here. But thank you to the RDF and the university for inviting me. It's the second time I've been here. It's always a privilege. And I want to thank my colleagues, Diane and the minister here, for sitting for all of us. I wanted to just to share with you maybe something a bit broader in terms of what are the lessons that we draw from this crisis, and what are the policy implications at the country level, at the continental level, and globally. The first thing I want to say, especially at a gathering like this, if it was said in the morning, I apologize, is how badly the world was prepared for this pandemic. So bad. From rich countries to poor countries. Preparation was just inadequate for this pandemic. And the reason is not a difficult one to see. It is that pandemics have always been seen as a problem for poor countries, not for rich countries. When a pandemic threatens rich countries, they have a way to deal with it, and very soon it becomes an endemic for poor countries, but no longer a problem for rich countries. And therefore, there was no architecture for preparation from the United States to Europe to Africa. There simply wasn't. When Ebola broke out, you could say the same. or this is a problem for some small countries in West Africa. It's not an issue for the world. So this is the first point I want to say, because it has policy implications for what we do and for what the world does. In other words, I'm not sure that I can see forward, but I'm sure once the rich countries have vaccinated their people enough, this Ebola will become not a pandemic anymore, it will be an endemic problem for poor countries. And that has serious policy implications, both at economic and social level. So that's the first thing I want to say to you, because it has a link with what I will say about policy. The second thing I want to say also to a gathering like this is that precisely because of the first problem, science is always able to provide solutions. Imperfect, but science always provides solutions. So right now, diagnostics, some degree of therapeutics, and vaccines are available because of the work of science, but they are available only largely in rich countries. In other words, solutions from science are available. But I'm sure this morning the Minister of Health will have told you, or maybe Dr. John from AU, how we struggled at the beginning of this crisis to get to testing kits, to get to things we needed to test the people. It is the same issue now with vaccines. Now, I'm not blaming rich countries for looking after their people first. That's what it should be. But I'm only saying that it has implications for what we do in our countries. So science is available, but science is available often only for some. And I link up with my first point about pandemics becoming endemics for the poor. I do chair the Global Fund for AIDS, Malaria, and Tuberculosis. And Pichet, this is why I was late. I was chairing that meeting. So I apologize. When HIV/AIDS first appeared in the world, it was a threat for rich people, poor people. But very soon it has become a problem for poor people in poor countries. There's very little research going on in tuberculosis. Right now, about 500,000 children under 5 die from malaria. That is more than all the casualties from COVID. So when people talk about pandemics, you should always bear in mind, pandemics are often defined as a function of what threatens rich people in rich countries. When, like HIV/AIDS, or tuberculosis, or malaria, is no longer a threat for them, it becomes an issue for the World Bank, African Development Bank, Bill Gates, philanthropy. It's no longer a problem for them. And what I want to say here, I fear that very soon COVID will be the same. It will become an endemic issue for us, but no longer be defined as a pandemic. There's a lot of reflection now about what to do to better prepare for the future. There's been a discussion about a treaty on pandemics. But you have to ask the question, whose treaty will it be? Who will enforce it? In whose interest? It's such an important issue for me to make in a gathering like this, because all policy discussions must flow from this. The third lesson, and I have 5, is about the global supply chains. In 2007, I was still president of the African Development Bank. I see Africa is there, I think he was still in the bank. We had something called the food crisis. It was called the food crisis. In fact, it was actually a bit of financial speculation in the commodity markets. Immediately, a number of countries banned exports of wheat, rice, and the rest of it. All right? They banned exports. What is happening now in terms of vaccine, for example, is exactly the same. A number of countries are not willing to share vaccines which are available or to make them available to the market. All right? It's okay to sing about free trade, WTO, and all this. But these global supply chains are not working for us. I'm sure in the morning the Minister of Health will have told you what this means now in terms of thinking about manufacturing vaccines and other drugs in our own countries. But can every country manufacture its own vaccines and drugs and everything? The chance is no. But there are opportunities here now to think hard about what it means for some of our countries in terms of entering some of the global supply chains of things we'll need, henceforth. It is no longer enough to say, well, if there is a breakdown of disease, we'll buy drugs from India or from China or from Europe. The chances are sometimes those things will simply not be available. And this has implications for trade. I think when I came in, Diana was talking about trade and the continental free trade area. Right now, there's serious discussion of what can be done to provide the economies of scale for some countries, not all, to produce their own vaccines and medicines. And that means discussions among our countries about trade and regional supply chains. I can come to that. My third or fourth lesson, I think, I had 5, is this. I did say that at the beginning the world was badly prepared for this pandemic. Actually, ironically enough, the continent best prepared was Africa. It's not me saying, it's a WHO. Africa was better prepared than some of the rich countries. Because very early on, our governments could see the threats to our countries. So they took measures, lockdowns, curfew, stopped international travel. People did not understand fully. But this has helped to limit the damage of the pandemic. We still have problems to deal with. There's new variants from India and so on. We don't know the trajectory of this virus. But at country level, at African Union level, there was very good preparation. I think John must have mentioned this morning. At the time, the President of South Africa, who was then chairman of the AU, appointed a couple of envoys, including myself, to try to imagine solutions, both economic to this problem. And this is what we have been doing. I think we're the only continent to have done that. Now, why am I saying this? Often, when there's a problem in the world, Africa is presented as a victim. So at the beginning of this crisis, people said millions and millions will die in Africa. All right? Now, we have had suffering, death, but the catastrophe predicted for Africa has not happened at the pandemic level. But the economic cost has been very high. Before the pandemic crisis, the average rate of growth among about 17 countries in Africa was about 7%, which means 3 points above population increase. So we had problems. We're doing much better than other countries from a low base, but we're doing much better. Now many of the countries are in recession. And that recession means our fiscal base will be narrower, we'll have less revenues. At the time we need more expenditures. And so this lack of fiscal space as a result of what we did right to protect our people is something for which you would have thought the international community could have responded to, as they should. I tell you, we have for a whole year been struggling very, very hard on this issue. You'll have heard that countries in the north have put in their economies a huge amount of stimulus, unforeseen, unseen. They have broken all the fiscal rules, all the monetary rules, to save their economies, their businesses. I mean, in some countries, the numbers are simply beyond imagination. And it is beginning to work, by the way, for them. If you look at the commodity prices now, from copper to iron ore to the rest of it, we are the highest since 2011. I've never seen copper prices break through the $10,000 per ton. It has, because of all this liquidity which has been thrown into the market. But how about those countries in the south, without the fiscal space? What do you do? So I want to say here, that the exception in the rule has been the International Monetary Fund. Because the leadership in the IMF has understood the issues. And what they have done is that, I'm sure Pichette have been following, typically in every year before the pandemic, International Monetary Fund to support Africa would be about $3 billion per annum. As I speak with you, at $26 billion. Unseen. But the problem is this, it helps, but it's short-term debt. It has to be paid back in 5 years. It's not very expensive debt. It means it eats up your debt headroom. It has to be repaid, but it has helped to stabilize balance of payments, currencies, that kind of stuff. But how about other partners? So an idea was floated by several of us, including head of the IMF, that there should be an equivalent action at international level to help countries in the South stimulate their economies. And a proposal was made to issue what is known as the special drawing rights. I don't want to go into technicalities, but basically additional financial support to these countries by mechanism, but they would cost very little to rich countries. So to give you an idea, during the global financial crisis in 2008 and 2009, at the time, President Obama, people like Gordon Brown, and many others put a proposal on the table that the level of the special drawing rights be increased by 10 times. So it went from $21 billion per year to about $210 billion, and it helped to provide liquidity in the system. This time around, it has been very, very hard. I don't want to go into details of which countries opposed what. That is for other people, but it was very, very hard. It has taken another year. It's only recently when a decision was taken to increase SDRs from about $210 billion to $650 billion. But what is the problem? The problem is that these resources are distributed according to your quota in the International Monetary Fund. And because the quota of Africa is very small, all we get is $33 billion out of the $650 billion. $33 billion. It is not enough. So there is a proposal on the table, supported many people, many leaders, including our own president. He has written a letter to some of his colleagues, the G20, to do what would be the most logical, simple thing to do. Reallocate some of those resources to countries who don't need them, will not need them, to those who need them, using a mechanism we can discuss. And the head of the IMF has said, yes, President Macron, Chancellor Merkel, many other people. And now recently also the Treasury Secretary of the United States, very supportive of this idea. However, there are a lot of issues to be resolved because we're looking at getting to around $200 billion. There's a kind of stimulus level we need in the South for our economies at a time when the fiscal space is very small. Now, my last lesson from this crisis is perhaps not surprising to you. You'll have heard in the morning. And that is the importance of actually, from now on, thinking hard about investing in public health. Because now we can see that there is a clear link, a direct line, between investments in public health and the economy. And now, we have always known this, but never have we seen such a direct link between the health sector and the economy. And so it means our countries will have to think very hard about the kind of budgets we provide for the ministers of health, Minister of Water, and all other determinants of health. But it is not simply about spending more, it is spending better. It is figuring out how for every dollar you get value for your money. It will be a challenge for policymakers. I'm sure maybe this morning it was mentioned. But if it wasn't, I do want to say that for African countries, we'll have to think hard about what this means. Because international solidarity is limited, and we have to do things for ourselves. And again, there's an initiative in the African Union led by our president of increasing per capita spending on health in Africa from where it is now, which is about $30 per person, close to $100 per person. And many countries were on the way to getting there. But because of COVID, there's now a setback of about $10 per person. So it will take longer to get to $100 per person. But again, we'll have to think about how do you spend this money better. I can come to that, or you can ask other panelists. But this was the last lesson. Finally, so where do we go from here? Just 2 minutes and I'll be done. I think at the global level, first of all, at the global level, we have to go back probably to square one and think about what kind of international solidarity, what kind of international architecture we need to deal with these kind of threats. The system we have had since 1945, which has worked reasonably okay, is clearly not working today. This is why there is a discussion about international treaty on pandemics. You know, in 1945, because of what happened, so we created the UN, the World Bank, the IMF, WTO, and the rest of it. Come to 1973, during the global energy crisis, even that was not working perfectly. So something was put in place informally called the G7, in other words, the super rich countries. They came together to try and deal with the energy problem. Then it became G7 plus 1, I think, or G8, I'm not sure. Fast forward to 2008, even that was not working during the global financial crisis. All right? It went from G7 plus 1 or G8 to G20. Now, the rich and the super rich to resolve the problems of the world. The majority of the African countries were left out of this arrangement. All right? We're often invited as guests. This has implications for the way Africans think about the continental free trade area. It's simply not a trading arrangement. It's not simply a cooperation arrangement. It's bigger than that. And I don't have time to go into this, but I do believe once this crisis in its acute form is over, we'll have to think hard about this kind of economic cooperation and its implications for our politics, our security, and the rest of it. Now, let me end this by saying to you that there is a lot of discussion now about, so what to do about this particular pandemic, what is the implication for economies. I want to repeat what I said at the beginning. I am persuaded that once in the rich countries, a critical mass of people have been vaccinated, this should become an issue for us to handle. And so, from a health perspective, economic perspective, we need to rethink what to do. The Global Fund, which I chair, which we're thankful to countries who put money into it, has done quite a lot to make HIV/AIDS no longer a major threat to lives. Over 38 million people are on antiretroviral drugs. We provide support for malaria, tuberculosis. But these have become a problem for the poor countries. I am persuaded that COVID could also become soon a problem for poor countries. And so how would we then deal with a pandemic which has become an endemic problem, both economic and social? It has implications for what we do. I'm sure that when it comes to how we can help our companies, households who have suffered during this crisis, I'm sure Diane and the minister have mentioned, I don't have to get into this, but it requires us to rethink our economic policies fundamentally in several ways which I don't have time to go into. Just to give you an example, again, a long time ago when we were studying economics, the like of me, if anybody could have told me that we shall live in a world one day of negative interest rates, I'd have said, this cannot happen. In many countries now, interest rates have gone to -2, -3. So if you put your money in the bank, right, you won't get interest of 5%, you'll get -2, -3%. Because the central banks have gone out there to pour liquidity in the economies, to support firms, to support businesses, to support the people, in spite of the orthodoxy, which was, it can't happen. Even on the fiscal side, if you look at the level of debt in the world today, it is at the highest it has ever been, both corporate debt and sovereign debt. But it's often amazing when people talk about our countries, because debt to GDP ratio is at 60%, oh, well, there's a problem. I think this is not the time to worry about some of those parameters. It is important to manage them carefully, to monitor them carefully. In some countries, you might be at the limit. But for those countries who have managed their economies very well before this pandemic, and now are suffering a setback because of the pandemic, we may have to think about the new types of policies which we have not experimented with in the past. So, Pichet, I'm sorry I've been long because I came late. But if I've said something which others have said, I apologize. But this is what I want to share with you. Thanks.
Thank you very much for your 5 lessons. If you allow me, before we open up the floor for questions and answers, to have a follow-up question around one of your lessons regarding supply chains and global supply chains. Because once, as you've mentioned, once we move from a pandemic to an endemic, the needs of our economies in terms of supply chain will remain. We'll still need to get vaccines, we'll still need to get testing kits, we'll still have logistical needs for industries, for manufacturing. And one of the initiatives that we heard about during the pandemic from the AU was around common procurement and the possibility of doing common procurement as Africa on some of these much needed commodities. It would be interesting to hear whether was this initiative successful, are there lessons we can learn, maybe for other areas that may require kind of convergence when it comes to supply.
At the beginning of this crisis, because we could not get testing kits for COVID and the rest of it, so the African Union created a common platform, African Medical Supplies Platform. I don't know if John talked about it, to try and secure testing kits from companies around the world. It was a common platform in which our friend Strive Masiwa was also involved. It worked so well that even Caribbean countries joined it. All right? It worked extremely well, and it helped us access a few things here and there. We have the same mechanism called the AVAT, which is African Vaccination Acquisition Team, to which I belong. We're trying to do that, negotiating with all suppliers in the world, whatever they are, to try to get enough vaccines in a common pool. But there's some challenges which you can imagine. We have no time to go into them. So what has been done was an emergency measure, which would allow economies to continue to compete. We have different conditions. I'm more interested in how we actually effectively ensure that the CFTA, or even for countries who have gone far above CFTA, those who are in the Economic Union, Monetary Union, right? How we can actually make it effective so that we have scale whereby things can be banned in Rwanda, but they're available for the whole region. Things can be banned in Kenya, but they're available for the whole of COMESA. This is what I'm more interested in, and I think we should make happen. And as I've said here before, it is not simple about tariffs. I think tariffs have been managed. It's not even about infrastructure. We can deal with that. It is about other things which I'm sure Diane may have mentioned. It's about payment systems. It's about digital trading platforms. It's about harmonization of some policies which would make that happen. And I think the regional economic communities and the AU would be better advised to focus on these issues at the moment.
Maybe, Minister, do you want to start by giving us your views on whether the imbalanced trading system has been fixed or not? Is this still a topical issue?
Thank you. It is a topical issue, and with even more aggressivity, because we have seen during this pandemic especially the price commodities really falling down, and for the continent as a whole, we are like unable to do anything regarding those price commodities falling down. And it's where it comes joining the fact that the structure we're working in currently as a continent has to move, not just for producing these primary products or raw materials, but really to move to an added value with an emphasis on manufacturing. But I think also on the other side, to recover from that, we have to look at where we have niches and competitive advantages as a continent. And as Dr. Kalberg was saying, the fact of having manufacturing in our institutions is really key. But in the sense that we rather not move in terms of national, but rather regional value chains and even continental value chains. I think it's really key under even the IFCFTA to be sure that the countries comparing to the advantages they do have, they enter into a regional value chain or a global value chain. I think also we have still to work under the way we harmonize our policies so that we enable the way of having that unity in one single market. That I would add.
So I think the question was around strong planning systems. And I'll tell you, when the pandemic hit last year, in our worst business continuity planning scenario, the worst scenario was an earthquake in Kigali taking down our building and our primary data center. So we were prepared for that. For that kind of scenarios, we were prepared. But I think what this pandemic has shown is that we need to be, we need to broaden our risk assessment frameworks to also consider, pandemics where people are not even able to go to work. We usually have, in the banking industry, we have the maker-checker system to make sure that the risks and we have the risks are controlled. But in this case, you didn't have anyone in office, so we needed to work all remotely and make sure all our systems are online, and not only keep lights on in terms of allowing people to transact, but we also needed to give lifelines to our clients for them to continue operate, even at 20% capacity. We had to be there to support our clients. So now what we're doing is to review all these risk assessment frameworks that we have and broaden the number of scenarios. Today, when I stress test my balance sheet, for example, I'll say the sector of agriculture is going to have a bad year, a bad season. What is this going to have as impact on my books? But an incident like a pandemic, it has an impact on everything, on the way you work, on all business lines, all sectors, and now we need to be prepared for that. Now, when you think of a strong banking system, individual banks cannot work alone, because as Dr. Kaberuka put it, in these more richer countries, central banks have provided massive liquidity in the banking system to allow people to continue working, and these stimulus checks that were given, when you think of the numbers, you actually cannot count the number of zeros, and these are dollars, it's not Rwanda francs or Zimbabwean dollars. It's unbelievable. So I think as countries and as regions, we need to be prepared for these kind of incidences in the future, pandemics, economic shocks, because we have to be prepared to prepare as an industry, as a country. But obviously, as an institution, you have to have all your business continuity plans stress tested, and tested actually very frequently. We do that now. We've seen the number of digital transactions growing exponentially. I think 400% in the only month of April last year. And we needed to have systems that can permit everyone to transact digitally. So that required us to invest heavily in infrastructure, hardware, software, etc. But also, I believe the next threat that is coming now that everything is moving to digital is cyber. And I believe when I see military here, I believe the warfare is moving to the digital world. And today, everything is digital. At some point, we'll also need to agree as a country, how do we protect our systems for all the bad people out there who want to take advantage of vulnerabilities and weaknesses. So planning is crucial, not only at micro level of a company, but it's actually very important at country level and at regional level. Thank you.
For Rwanda-specific policies, I think I have ministers here, so I'd rather leave the minister to answer the question. I'm talking about Africa as a whole. And we don't have enough time, but I'm just going to pick two of them. Take all these African central banks. Where do you think they put their reserves? All right? I can't blame them because in the past, so they have reserves. Last time I counted when I was in the African Development Bank, if you put all the reserves together, trillions of them. So they put the money out because they want security, liquidity, and a return. All right? But I've just told you that the negative interest rate abroad means that they're not getting any return. All right? Arthur, this is not a rocket science. All I'm saying is, can you now think about how we can pool some of our reserves internally within Africa and manage them in a way which is provide them security, provide them liquidity, and probably a better return. It's okay to put your money in the Federal Bank of New York. That is fine. It is secure. You have liquidity. But the chances are you don't get much of a return. And we don't have time to go through this. I'm just giving you one. That itself could be a sea change, the way we manage our external reserves. Let me give you a second one, and I will stop there. You see, for a long time, I myself was a believer in opening all your industries to free trade. All right? There's two ex-commerce ministers here, so I should be careful what I say. Over time, I've become less of a believer in that. I believe, as countries like Vietnam have done, and others, you probably have to think around your economies. Some areas need some degree of competition. Some areas need some degree of large openness, but other areas need some degree of protection. Yes, protection. All right? The idea that you have to open up your entire economy is something I used to believe in. Right now, I think it has been nuanced. I'm not saying it should be total closing. No, I'm only saying progressive, sectoral, sector by sector. This is what Vietnam have done. You and I can have this debate if you want. All right? Because that has a link with your free trade area, the challenges we're having. We're going to come to it. Third, policy, which I think we can re-examine. And that is not very, very difficult. It's about how we design social protection in the way which Rwanda has done. Because you asked me about Rwanda specifically, the ministers here. Rwanda does not have much resources, but the social protection schemes here work much better than in some of the wealthier countries in Africa. And as a result, when you have a pandemic like this, the population suffering is bigger in some of the countries who have much more resources. Because the way they design social policy, social protection is not fit for purpose. But I can even go further to areas like natural resource management, all right? I can go to areas which, again, I should be careful sitting next to the minister here. I looked at, when I was in the African Development Bank, at the amount of money we lose as African countries by giving tax holidays and investment incentives to some of these rich companies in the world. All right? Because we believe we give them tax holidays, we give them a huge investment incentives, they come invest, they create jobs, they pay taxes. The reality is there's no evidence that that works. None whatsoever, especially in areas like mining. I've been thinking that maybe some of those resources we use to provide those huge incentives, which provide leakages, maybe should be used to support our small businesses. Because that's why jobs are created in Africa, 80% of jobs, 50% of GDP. So it is this kind of shifts I have in mind. Macro policies, they're fine. But there are some things you have to take a second look at, especially in some of the very wealthy countries in Africa. I don't have time to develop this, but I just want to give you one about reserves. You can go and research it. Figure out how much of our reserves is put in countries where interests are now negative. And tell me, why can't we come together, actually, manage those reserves in Africa, invest in infrastructure? Of course, we need reserves for a rainy day. We have to make sure that we have that buffers. All right? But I'm not persuaded anymore that we should be keeping our reserves in outlying countries when they can be invested here for different purposes. But I'm happy to discuss with you further. But for Rwanda-specific policy, I think, please address the question to the Minister. There was something about it?
The second one was on the challenges to realize the free trade area for Africa, the African FTA.
First of all, let me say that many countries are far, far above the CFTA. Remember, this kind of arrangements, you go from the PTA, preferential trade areas, okay? You reduce tariffs among yourselves, but you don't eliminate them. You go to the CFTA, the free trade area, you eliminate tariffs among yourselves, you keep them against foreign countries. Then you move up to customs union, to economic union, monetary union. There are many regions of Africa which are far, far above the CFTA. So that is the bare minimum. What is making not happen? It used to be tariffs. It's no longer tariffs. Infrastructure, we're getting there. It is the kind of things I've mentioned. It is a policy, especially harmonization, payment systems. If you're Rwandan and wants to buy Zambian goods, you have to find dollars, all right? Digital platforms, and so on. The soft things we need to work on. But that said, economic cooperation is never easy. I mean, ask the Europeans, see how they are struggling after so many years. But I do believe there are some regions of Africa now where we need to move faster in terms of getting to higher levels of cooperation in terms of trade. Now, somebody asked me about silencing the guns.
Yes.
I'm not sure I'm the expert on that in an audience like this. But one time the African Union asked me to help them raise money for peace support operations, to help our countries when they have some challenges. People are very skeptical, but I can tell you now that today, for the first time, the African Union has a peace fund which has $220 million. All right? You may say that is small, but the budget of the African Union per year, admin budget, is about $350 million. The peace fund has $220 million. So the AU today can deploy resources in different ways. They have to decide. What they have to do now is to decide how the AU cooperates with other organizations to figure out how those resources should be deployed. But I was scandalized at the beginning of this exercise when I found that when the AU decided that, for example, there was need to send some maybe defense observers in some country, it had to go to embassies looking for funds. As small as $100,000. All right? Now, they have resources of their own, and they have ambition to bring to $500 million, which I think they will. And the idea is to get those who want to support the peace fund to bring their own resources in the peace fund. For example, the Amazon in Somalia, it used to cost there was about maybe $400 million from the EU, which was passed on to the Amazon people. Now it will be possible for EU, for example, to provide the resources to the African Peace Fund to augment what is there, for there to be some capabilities, both for readiness, for prevention, especially prevention, because prevention is not very expensive. I found that if we spend a lot of resources on prevention, it will be about $50 million a year, at least from what I could see from the numbers. Yeah, so there's some political work to be done, but I think on the mean side, I think the AU is getting where it should be, and over time, I hope they raise a bit more.
Thank you. Thank you very much.